History has shown a repeated pattern, one that has brought down three powerful governments in the last 250 years. In 2025, the United States is moving through that same sequence, step by step, tension by tension. It almost feels like the country is following a script written by centuries of conflict. In 1789, France stood as Europe's greatest power, wealthy, cultured, and seemingly unshakable. Yet within 5 years, its entire government had collapsed. The king was executed, and the nation plunged into the reign of terror, where tens of thousands were killed over political accusations. In 1917, Russia was a massive empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. The country had just endured World War I, but within 8 months, the entire regime fell apart. The Tsar was killed, and the Bolsheviks seized control, leading to a civil war that took over 20 million lives. Then, in 1959, Cuba, once a flourishing and modern Caribbean nation, fell to Fidel Castro. Within 2 years, the government was overthrown. Industries were seized, and a communist dictatorship ruled for 6 decades. 3 revolutions, 3 governments that appeared strong. And in every case, the ruling class never believed collapse was even possible. They thought the people were powerless, the system too solid to fail. They were wrong each time. And now, every warning sign that came before those revolutions is appearing in the modern United States. Widening inequality, corruption, collapsing trust in institutions, and growing anger beneath the surface. America isn't heading toward the pattern, it's already deep inside it. Stage 4. This story isn't just about history. It's about how revolutions ignite, why governments always fail to see them coming, and why the data suggests the U.S. is entering the same dangerous trajectory. Every major revolution starts long before the first protest, the first shot, or the first fallen leader. It begins quietly with economic strain, political frustration, and a slow erosion of public trust. And the frightening part is that these warning signs look almost identical across different countries and different eras. Take France in the 1780s. The nation's elite lived in unimaginable luxury, while ordinary citizens struggled just to buy bread. Taxes crushed the poor, but protected the rich. People didn't revolt overnight, endured years of frustration until the pressure became unbearable. When the spark finally came, the entire system collapsed in months. Russia in 1917 followed the same script. Decades of inequality, corruption, and mismanagement built a deep bitterness among the population. Breadlines grew, inflation spiraled, and the government denied the seriousness of the crisis until it was too late. When the first protests erupted, the empire folded with shocking speed. Cuba's story wasn't much different. Behind the glamorous hotels and wealthy elites was a nation where many citizens had no political voice and no economic opportunity. The government believed its control was absolute right up until the moment it wasn't. What all these revolutions had in common was not just economic hardship, but something far more dangerous: a total collapse of faith in the system. Once people no longer believe their leaders are acting in their interest, once they feel the rules are rigged, a breaking point becomes inevitable. And in today's America, those same early tremors are visible: record inequality, political polarization at extremes, collapsing trust in media, government, and institutions, widespread belief that the system is failing ordinary people. These aren't random issues. They're the exact same symptoms that emerged in France, Russia, and Cuba right before their revolutions erupted. Revolutions don't erupt randomly. They happen when a society reaches a point where ordinary people no longer feel they have anything left to lose. When frustration turns into anger, and anger slowly transforms into collective action. Before every major collapse, there is always a moment subtle, almost invisible, when the public mood shifts. People stop hoping things will improve. They stop trusting promises. They stop believing the system can fix itself. And once that trust is gone, the countdown begins. At France, that moment came when even the price of bread became unbearable. When families spent most of their income just to survive, they realized the government had abandoned them. The anger was no longer quiet. It was ready to explode. In Russia, the turning point was hunger. Soldiers returning from war found their families starving, while the ruling class remained insulated from suffering. The belief that the leaders don't care about us spread like wildfire. It was no longer a political opinionate, was a national truth. In Cuba, the shift happened when the gap between the elite and the rest of the population became too large to ignore. The luxurious lives of the few stood in violent contrast with the hopelessness of the many. That imbalance created the perfect environment for a revolution to take root. And now, America is experiencing its own version of that shift. Income inequality has reached levels not seen in a century. Home ownership for younger generations feels increasingly impossible. Millions believe the political system is broken beyond repair, and trust in institutions has fallen to historic lows. When a population begins to feel powerless, unheard, and economically trapped, the foundation beneath a nation cracks. It doesn't crumble all at once, it erodes slowly, then fails suddenly. These conditions don't guarantee a revolution, but history shows they create the exact environment where one becomes possible. Every collapsing government has one unmistakable pattern. The people in power slowly disconnect from the people they govern. They stop seeing the suffering, they stop feeling the pressure, and eventually they stop believing a crisis is even possible. This separation is not always intentional. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, as the elite begin living in an entirely different world than the rest of the population. In pre-revolutionary France, nobles lived in palaces, hosted extravagant feasts, and spent fortunes on luxuries, while ordinary citizens starved in the streets. The ruling class simply couldn't imagine the level of desperation building outside their walls. Russia had the same story. The Tsar and his inner circle lived in absolute comfort, isolated from the chaos consuming the empire. While soldiers froze on the battlefield and families waited in endless food lines, the elites insisted that everything was under control. They believed stability was guaranteed right until the moment it collapsed. Cuba followed the same trajectory. The wealthy and politically connected lived like they were in a paradise, blind to the anger and poverty spreading across the island. They assumed the public would remain silent forever. They were disastrously wrong. This isn't just history, it's a warning. Because today in the United States, the divide between the elite and the average American is wider than it has been in generations. A small group controls extraordinary wealth. Political power is concentrated in the hands of a few, and millions of ordinary citizens feel invisible, ignored, and shut out of opportunity. The upper class believes the system is stable because it's stable for them. But for many Americans, the lived reality is entirely different. Stagnant wages, overwhelming debt, skyrocketing living costs, and declining social mobility. When the people at the top live in a separate reality, they cannot see the pressure building underneath. And history shows that revolutions almost always erupt when the ruling class is convinced that nothing can go wrong. The moment the system stops listening to its own people, it unknowingly plants the seeds of its own collapse. Stage 5 of every revolution is the moment when the movement stops being a fringe idea and becomes a force impossible to ignore. It's when ordinary people see the alternative as not just appealing, but necessary. In France, the Jacobins didn't just speak to radicals, they drew in the masses. They promised justice, vengeance against corruption, and a vision of a better society. The moderates had failed to solve the crisis. People were hungry, angry, and ready to follow leaders who offered action, extreme action. Russia followed the same blueprint. Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered peace, land, and bread. They understood the grievances of soldiers, workers, and peasants. The provisional government had promised reforms but delivered nothing. Ordinary Russians, desperate for solutions, threw their support behind the revolutionaries. Cuba mirrored this pattern. Fidel Castro didn't immediately overthrow Batista. He built a disciplined movement, winning hearts and minds along the way. Villagers, students, and urban professionals all rallied not because they loved him, but because they hated the existing regime and saw no alternative. By the time Batista fled, Castro commanded a mass movement capable of seizing power. This stage isn't just about ideology, it's about opportunity meeting desperation. When a government fails to address the needs of the people, the masses are ready to shift their loyalty to anyone who promises change, no matter how radical. In this stage is extremely dangerous. Once a revolutionary movement gains mass support, moderation is sidelined. Extremes dominate the conversation. Negotiation becomes impossible. Compromise is seen as weakness. People are no longer asking for reform, they are demanding transformation. In today's United States, we can already see the early signs. Some groups are increasingly attracted to radical policies, extreme rhetoric, or authoritarian ideas, not necessarily because they fully believe in them, but because they feel the system has failed them. Discontent is spreading. Anger is mobilizing. Polarization is intensifying. The conditions for Stage 5 are forming. When Stage 5 begins in full, history tells us it moves fast. Ordinary citizens, once silent, take to the streets. Vote for revolutionary policies or join movements promising radical change. Extremists gain legitimacy. Moderates lose influence. And the country teeters on the edge of chaos. Stage 6 is the final act of the revolutionary cycle. It's when the old order collapses completely and chaos takes over. The system that people once trusted is gone, replaced by uncertainty, fear, and often new tyranny. In France, after the Jacobins gained power, the revolution spiraled into the terror. From 1793 to 1794, tens of thousands were executed: nobles, clergy, moderates, even fellow revolutionaries. Extremists who led the revolution devoured their own supporters. Public executions became spectacles, and the society descended into fear and mistrust. By 1799, after a decade of turmoil, Napoleon seized control, replacing revolutionary chaos with a military dictatorship. Russia experienced a similar collapse. The Bolsheviks took power in 1917, but the country plunged into civil war. Millions died from fighting, famine, and purges. Lenin's promises of peace, land, and bread were replaced with collectivization, rationing, and authoritarian control. Stalin's rise later brought even greater terror. 20 million more would die in purges and famines. The revolution that promised liberation delivered dictatorship. Cuba followed the same path. Castro's takeover in 1959 ended Batista's corrupt rule, but soon political opponents were imprisoned or executed. The press was censored, and nationalization seized private property. The revolution brought a new regime that ruled with iron control for 6 decades. Those who had hoped for freedom found repression instead. The pattern is clear. Revolutions rarely create the utopia they promise. Extremists gain control, moderates are removed, and society faces violence, chaos, and authoritarianism. The aftermath is almost always worse than the problems that sparked the revolution. In the United States today, Stage 6 hasn't arrived, but the warning signs are visible. Political violence could escalate, organized extremist groups could challenge authority, and public trust in institutions might collapse entirely. Supply chains, food, and energy systems could break down. States might resist federal control, and foreign powers could interfere. The result would be a fractured nation, possibly under authoritarian rule or divided into separate regions. Millions could suffer. Stage 6 is not inevitable if preventative action is taken. But history teaches us that once a society reaches Stage 4 and moves toward Stage 5, halting the cycle becomes extraordinarily difficult. The wealth gap, government dysfunction, and loss of faith in institutions are combining in the United States just as they did in France, Russia, and Cuba before chaos erupted. Understanding this stage is crucial. Stage 6 is the ultimate warning. Revolutions consume not only the old order but often the hopes of the people who initiated them. Without reform, without restoring trust, the descent into chaos becomes almost certain.